I want to begin by asking a few questions that really pick up on the last point that you made when you're interacting with Rob Dreyer's Benedict option. And then I'll open it up to questions from the floor, if you will, after we have a little bit of elaboration on those. And I'll start with what you said in your May 4 post. You wrote, "Is the culture war over, or to use less marital language, is Christian cultural engagement at an end? At the risk of depriving a rapidly shrinking handful of old-school Republicans and countless trendy Christian blog pundits of their reason to exist, I believe the answer is yes, it is over. For to engage a culture, there must first be a culture to engage." Can you elaborate on what you meant there?
Yeah, I'm working with a particular definition of culture in that statement. I think culture is typically defined, or the way I want to define it, is that system of beliefs, institutions, organizations, and relations that transmit a society's values and identity from generation to generation. I think we don't have that anymore. I think we're at a stage now in maybe the West as a whole, but certainly the United States, where the past is simply being eradicated. I mean, marriage is the most obvious example. I said, nobody questioned the basic fundamentals of marriage until very, very recently. Now you can't talk about traditional marriage without sounding like a Klansman in the wider culture. Using the term there in a more broad sense. But yeah, I think that the idea that we could somehow rebuild a culture in the sense of a coherent society that is transmitting a stable identity and set of beliefs, moral principles from generation to generation, I think that's done. I don't think, I think so many things would have to happen for that to take place, that simply dominating the Supreme Court won't do it. I think it's a much more widespread problem.
Did you happen to see Russell Moore's speech that he gave at the Erasmus?
I missed that. I've yet to watch that.
I'm interested in your take on this issue as it relates to what you said, and it'll come into the Benedict option discussion a bit. But on the issue of transformation, you hear Christians will talk about the church's role is to have some transformational impact. It's quite a debate that goes on. How do you view that you have the one side, this transformational idea, on the other side you have this, it's all going to probably, I'm generalizing, but it's all going to get really bad. The church just needs to be the church and not worry about if it gets bad. How do you deal with those two sides of it?
I'd answer it in two ways. One, I'm very sympathetic to the second half of that. I do think the church has to be the church, which is why I concluded the way I did today. But that doesn't mean that the church will not have an impact on society. I mean, take, for example, voting. I'm not, as a pastor, I'm not going to stand up and tell anybody in my congregation how to vote. Nor am I going to investigate how they voted and discipline them on the grounds that they voted for the wrong candidate. What I am going to do week by week is preach the Word of God and apply it to them in a way that I think is appropriate, and do that prayerfully, and trust that the Word of God is transforming hearts and minds, so that when they operate as individuals in the civic sphere, they will do so informed by Christian wisdom, and that will change the way they operate as employees. It may affect the way they vote, even if it simply means they hold their nose and vote for one candidate rather than holding their nose and voting for the other. I mean, there's never going to be an ideal candidate to vote for from a Christian perspective. So I do think that the church can have an impact on society, but it's through the transformation of the lives of individual Christians who then go off and live as Christians in the civic sphere. It's not my job as pastor to preach party politics from the pulpit.
Now, how do you feel if the church then isn't having the culture's lost, as you say, is that telling about what the church isn't doing then? Would you say there's a connective? Is it as simple as to say the American church has not done a good job in preaching so that there would be this transformation of the members and then would have an impact? How do you see that relationship?
I think we should be very cautious when we're trying to guess at what God is doing in any particular point in society. I mean, when you think about it, Paul dies in prison. I was just preaching last Friday at an ordination service. I chose text from the pastoral epistles. And Paul is dying in prison, and he's writing to Timothy, and he's telling Timothy one of the things he's saying is, don't despair, don't be ashamed of me, don't be ashamed of my gospel. Well, you could easily look at Paul and say, well, 30 years ago, there were thousands of people converted at Pentecost. Now you're languishing in prison. Have you done something, is this because you've not been faithful and done something wrong? I think the logic of the cross as we see it played out in the life of Paul, and the logic of the cross as we see it played out in the history of the church is such that we cannot judge from outward circumstances whether the Lord is judging us. He may well be, but I don't think we can assume that. Certainly the church should always be repenting for its sins and should always be turning to Christ for forgiveness. But I don't think we should necessarily look at American society and say this is a judgment on the church. It might be just a judgment on Americans in general. So I think we have to be cautious about reading the times too easily from what's going on. I mean, one other example is people say, abortion will bring the judgment of God on the nation. Well, no. If you read Romans 1, abortion is the judgment of God on the nation. People giving up natural affection, that's a sign that judgment's already arrived. So I think the idea of our current condition being one of judgment has to be parsed very carefully.
Thank you. You mentioned Rob Drayer's Benedict option, and I wanted just to quote you and then have you elaborate a little bit, because I think it's you had a very helpful interaction with his work on that particular subject. You outlined the so-called Ben op. That's the popular way to say it. Conventional politics will not, these are the points. Conventional politics will not save us. We should have limited expectations about the benefit of political engagement, especially on the national level. And of course, you make note of the fact it doesn't mean we are disengaged. It simply means we have to recognize its place. Secondly, the church is not the world. There's a distinction between the church and politics, if you will, or the government or society outside of the church. The Christians must retrieve their own traditions as the fundamental sources of their identities. I'm very curious about more comment on that. Christians must prioritize the local community as their sphere of action. Once more, this is not, repeat not, the same thing as saying that Christians should head for the hills. It's simply to say that they should be far more concerned for what is happening in their neighborhood than on Capitol Hill. And then a couple more points, well, one point. What we face is not a struggle with a culture, but strictly speaking, a clash of alternative cultures. This is where the language of the end of culture war needs to be understood correctly. It is not that we are to surrender to the dominant culture, it is rather that we are to model an alternative culture. And we are to do so first in our local communities. We both believe that the culture war is over and that our side has lost. This is you and Rob Dreher. And we both believe that the language of exile is appropriate for the imminent condition of Christians in the U.S. You addressed that a little bit, but maybe if you could elaborate a little further, I think there's some helpful things.
It's always great having stuff I've written quoted back at me and saying, well, what was I thinking exactly when I wrote that? I think, first of all, just a bit of background. I think the language of Benedict option is both a plus and a minus. The plus is it's a very catchy phrase for something, which has got attention and got people discussing the kind of issues that I touch on there. There are two minuses as far as I can see. One is it has a very monastic ring to it, which makes a lot of people think it is heading up the mountain, pulling up the drawbridges, withdrawing from society. That's not going to be an option because my congregation in Philadelphia, the 20, 30-somethings, they have student loans, for example. Something as simple as that ties them in to society in a way that's just not going to go away. They have to have jobs. They have to be paying into the society in which we exist in. The second slightly unfortunate thing about it is I actually think that what Rod is describing is something that's not that revolutionary. I mean, I'm glad that he's using this term because people think it is revolutionary. He's got them discussing it. But in some ways, it's what I've always understood the church to be. And that is the church, picking up on the language that Peter uses in the New Testament, the church is a community of exiles. That we live in this world, but our identity is in a heavenly place. And that should shape how we interact with and think about the things of this world. In terms of retrieving Christian identity, I think there is a sense in which Christians need to reorient themselves in a heavenly direction. Not in a way that means we're running up the hills and forming monasteries and disappearing from society, though we could probably do worse than that, I don't know. But I think it behoves Christian pastors to focus the minds of congregants on heavenly realities, because that's where our real identity lies. That may look different in different churches, how you do that pastorally, but I think that's of critical importance, if for no other reason that it lowers expectations here on earth. I mean, who knows? 10 years' time, there could be a massive Christian revival that sweeps the United States, and we have a wonderful president, wonderful House of Representatives and Senate. Who knows, that could happen. But even if it does happen, that doesn't change fundamental Christian identity, which is not connected ultimately in an ultimate sense to the things that are going on in this world, but is rooted in Christ in heaven. So what I was trying to point to in that is saying we need to remember that the church, we want to be good citizens while we're here. Daniel is a good example of somebody. He lives in Babylon, and he's a good, we would say in England, he's a good bloke in Babylon, but his mind and his identity, they're in the promised land. And I think Christians need to capture something of that. So we're not, Daniel was not at war with the Babylonian authorities, but his heart was in the promised land. And that's, I think, what we need to cultivate among Christian people. And one of the things that worries me about the Christian right is how polemical it would be, to the point, not that we shouldn't be outraged by some of the terrible things that happen in society, but to the extent that you almost felt, well, if we don't win this, then God is no longer in control. That's not true. That's not true.
Thanks. I have a couple connected, but they're a little looser. I just wanted to make sure I got a chance to ask. I thought in a kind of a Neil Postman-esque way, you wrote just before, I think it was just a few days before this last election, you said, "Yet perhaps as never before, we in America are about to get the leader we truly deserve." And I thought like you, I thought the election was going to go the other direction, so it wouldn't have mattered which one as far as that goes. One who most faithfully represents the current state of society that we have made. When all of life is politics and politics is entirely dependent upon the entertainment industry, what do we expect? It will inevitably descend into an ugly farce, will it not? Could you elaborate on that a little bit, or just...
it was funny. That week I taught a class on the ancient church, and the 4th century is very interesting in the ancient church because Christianity is persecuted at the start of the 4th century, then it's tolerated, and by the end of the 4th century, it's the official religion of the empire. The transformation is very dramatic. And one of the most interesting figures is a guy called Ambrose, who ends up as Bishop of Milan. But when the previous Bishop of Milan dies and the see, the diocese becomes vacant, there's this popular uprising demanding that Ambrose be made bishop. And Ambrose happens to be the governor. He's not even baptized at this point. He's not a member of the church. So they have to baptize him, ordain him, and consecrate him as bishop really quickly to get him in. And the way I play this in class, I say, isn't it fascinating that by the end of the 4th century, the qualifications for holding one of the highest offices in the Roman Empire, the qualifications for holding high office in the church are almost inseparable in the public mind from the qualifications for holding high office in the secular, it's a rather anachronistic word, but in the secular Roman Empire. Well, we're at a stage now where the qualifications for holding the highest office in the most powerful nation in the world are entertainment values, the ability to use the televisual media correctly. I mean, it's a real gift to me that the winner wasn't Hillary. The winner was Donald. He's a reality TV star. And it just struck me that, wow, we're a world, we're so dominated by television, entertainment, that this whole election in some ways has been a function of that industry. Very few serious issues discussed. I mean, even think of the presidential debates. They're not debates. You go back to the parliamentary debates in the House of Commons at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. These men would stand up and they would speak for 90 minutes to make their argument. And somebody would stand up and spontaneously respond to them for 45, 50 minutes, arguing back, and the argument would go back and forth. You get 90 seconds, give me your view of immigration. And if you can't express it in 90 seconds, you're going to look either like a policy wonk or an idiot, and you're going to be unelectable. That's the state of politics in this country, that it's sound bites. If there's an incredibly complex issue that you can't resolve in a tweet, then you're in trouble. Well, I think we're in deep trouble when very complex issues have to be resolved that way. But that was all that was on offer, it seemed to me, at the last election. And I'm not saying this as a British guy sneering American politics. It'd be just as bad back home, I'm sure, because the television is dominant there as well. But strikingly mediocre, I think, the politicians we have today. Strikingly mediocre.
That's very nice. I'm just interested pastorally, how are you going to guide your people related to the political scene today, and just even with this, a lot of change coming, and what are some of the things that you're saying to your folks?
Well, one, whenever I'm preaching through 1 Samuel at the moment, which is the kingdom, and I keep, of course, pointing away from the flawed earthly leaders to the great one who's to come. So I'm trying to do that heavenly reality thing. The other thing I do, and I've always done this and been very strict in doing it, whenever I lead in worship and do the pastoral prayer, I always pray for the civil magistrate. That the Lord will, I thank the Lord for placing us in a democracy, because frankly, whoever won a week ago on Tuesday, I'd still rather live here than North Korea. In fact, there are a lot of places that I'd rather live here than there, even many democracies. I've chosen to live in the United States. So I remind people in prayer that we are very fortunate to live in a nation where, as mediocre as our politicians are, we can at least try to get rid of them every 4 years, which is a great thing. And I always pray that the Lord will use the civil magistrates that he has appointed, because the civil magistrates are put in place by God, that he will use the civil magistrates that he has appointed to protect the innocent and to put down the guilty. And then I always pray for the civil magistrates at all levels, local, state, and federal, that if they don't know Christ as their own Savior, the Lord will bring them to know Christ as their own Savior. But I am studiously non-partisan in the way I pray. And when Paul says, pray for the civil magistrate, he's talking about Nero. I mean, there's nobody like Nero standing for election in the United States. Well, if Paul can call for prayer for hostile Roman emperors, then we can pray for whoever's sitting in the White House, because they're decent human beings compared to Nero. So I'm studiously careful in the way I present. I guess I have the advantage of being English, that I'm always under suspicion of being a political liberal anyway. So the people at Cornerstone have called me knowing that I'm not a safe political pair of hands. So they're just relieved that I am neutral, I think, rather than expressing any partisan position. But I think it's important for pastors to be very biblical in the sense of praying as Paul has instructed us to pray for the civil magistrate, and also being very grateful for the, even if they take away our tax exemptions, America's still a great country to live in compared to North Korea. I'm not going to move to North Korea if they pull tax exemptions. I might have to change my career. Well, that would be sad, and I'd be a little uncomfortable, but nobody's trying to take my life at the moment. So I do think we need to project that to people as well, that, again, the media hype these things up as if there's something really at stake. Well, often the stakes are actually fairly small in a lot of elections.
Thanks. I have one other prepared question. I'll save it for the last question. What I'd like to do now is give opportunity for other questions from the audience. So if you just want to raise your hand, I'll come and hand you the mic and you ask just about Mr. Reynolds. This is not set up, by the way. This is Paul on his own.
So in the taxonomy that you're using of economic man and psychological man, so much of the way that they're looking at how this election went is that the right went for economic man and the left went for psychological man. At least rhetorically speaking, they did. Yeah. And considering how there's sort of a homogeneous value system that Western democracies are starting to share, we could probably see a similar pattern shaking out over some of the other nations that our people come from. Yeah. And considering just how practical the political system is, considering that an appeal to, or at least what it looks like, an appeal to economic man won an election, a major election, because it was perceived that the left went so far for psychological man that they forgot about working people. Yeah. Who do you see shifting first? Do you see the left wanting to give up the psychological ground a little bit, or do you see the right giving into the psychological ground.
Yeah, interesting. I was sitting in the airport today. I can't remember his name, but there was a Democratic politician clearly trying to organize a coup against Nancy Pelosi. And I was just interested listening to his speech that he was saying we have to reconnect with white working class people, white poor people. So place that. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a triumph of economic man over psychological man. I'd want to know what was motivating the white working class bloc. Was it, strictly speaking, that they feel they're not finding their meaning by being involved in the economic system, or is it that the economic system is preventing them from buying the stuff that makes them feel happy? I wonder as well if the situation in the election, to draw an analogy with Brexit, it seems that Brexit, when you look at the voting again, you can do those griffs, who voted for what. England, Wales and Scotland are different, but in England the voting went, I think, along lines of those who have done well from globalization voted to stay. Those who feel they've done badly from globalization voted to leave. And I wonder if that plays into the American election as well, because if you're in New York, then, hey, globalization's great. You've got cool restaurants and banks setting up, and there's money coming in, and you're able to live the cool New York life. If you're in, on the Rust Belt, and you're seeing jobs being shipped to Mexico or shipped to South Korea, globalization is damaging you at that point, and that too may shape the way you vote. So I'm not sure that it's a simple psychological versus economic man for a number of reasons. I suspect there's more economics on the left, and there's also more psychology among the white working class than perhaps we've allowed for. And I want to say with Reef's taxonomy, it is more complicated than he makes out. We're really talking about dominant paradigms, not exclusive paradigms. It's not that economic man vanishes, now everyone's psychological man. There's something of all of them in all of us all the time, but it's the dominant one, it's the one that grips the imagination, I think, that is important. But certainly this election is very interesting from that perspective. It sees the emergence of another identity block, white poor people, which makes me even more pessimistic about whether the nation state can survive, because there has to be a common identity to accept the results of elections. You see it with Brexit. A majority vote for Brexit, but the minority are trying to derail it. I even saw an intelligent commentator like Matthew Paris last week saying, well, maybe we need to end democracy, because if we have Brexit and Donald Trump, maybe democracy is not working. What he means is it's not giving us the results we want. And he's a moderately conservative, very intelligent commentator. He's not a loony left guy at all. I wonder if we're seeing the whole idea of democracy and the nation state coming under great strain at this point. That's a non-theological question, but that would be one of my thoughts about the election.
Thanks. Other questions?
Having entered the rise of the psychological man, the dominance of that, is there any historical precedent for what to expect from our culture? I mean, do we have some idea what they're going to say about us in 100 years?
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Great thing about being a historian is I'm much more confident about talking about the past than predicting the future. And the other thing is, when you look back at history, civilizations commit suicide and civilizations pull back from the brink. And the only way you know which is they actually do it. Right up until the last moment, you don't know which way they're going to go. There is a sense in which, if transgenderism is the apotheosis, the final term of psychological man, I think there comes a point at which society has to pull back or commit suicide on this issue. I mean, sooner or later, if the law is not willing to recognize the authority of the body, there is no such thing as society. If it turns out that the now Caitlyn Jenner, I'm not saying that they did, but let's just say he killed somebody in 1980. Is he going to be able to plead, well, I'm a different person now. I'm a woman now. It was a man who committed that crime. Is the law going to be prepared to accept that as a defense? At this point in time, I don't think they would. But you can see the problem. So I think transgenderism, much more significant than gay marriage. I mean, gay marriage is a huge blow, I think, to traditional families. The odd thing is that the gay community is now trying to reconstruct the traditional family in a way, which is, a much better situation than one might have anticipated. Transgenderism, I think, is far more deadly in terms of the continuation of civilization as we know it, because if it's pushed to its logical conclusion, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. From a Christian perspective, I think that there was a section of my paper I left out, but the body, the transgender delusion can only continue for so long, because you can identify as a living person all you want, but your body's going to die. Your body will be sovereign in the end. And maybe that provides, ironically, maybe death provides a ray of hope for Christian witness. Because you can identify as a live woman, you can be a man identifying as a live woman all you want, you're going to die. Your body will have the last word. Cellular entropy or whatever it is will take its toll. And so there is a sense, I think, in which we're going to get mugged by reality. So if I had to put my money on us pulling back from the brink, I'd say yes. But I would add this one caveat. Yes, the body will ultimately assert its authority. Hitler was never going to eradicate the Jews, but he did an awful lot of damage trying to do so. We're never going to get out from under the authority of the body, but boy, we can do a huge amount of damage in attempting to do so. So I think we might pull back from the brink, but I fear it could be a couple of generations away, and I fear the damage will be terrible. I'm turning 50 next year, and I'm of a mind, okay, this is my world till I go. I'm not going to see the rebuilding of civilization as I knew it in my lifetime, but maybe 100 years from now it will happen.
First of all, thank you for being here. It's great to have this kind of conversation among brothers and sisters in Christ who love Christ and who have been made alive. My thoughts on this, as I wrestle with these kind of thoughts, are we not just simply absent from the gates of society? What the voice, as you have so well articulated, that is prevalent are those that are in the media. They have taken over the storytelling of our culture, and they have taken over the arts and are prevalent. Where are the Christians?
Yeah.
They are absolutely absent. So in my thinking, I go back to the thought that God is sovereign, God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, He is active in the transformation of individuals, and those individuals are not to remain silent and pietistic to themselves, but they are to be transformative of culture, as you have stated, in our neighborhoods. But it goes not only to our neighborhoods, it goes to our education system, our legal system, entertainment, the arts, etc. How can we rally, or how are Christians rallied, and how do the churches work to do what they're called to do?
Yeah.
Because God has not removed the cultural mandate.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think there are a number of things that would have to be done if hypothetically we were to transform things. One, there'd have to be institutional transformation. And the problem with that now is that many institutions are going to be closed a priori to people holding Christian or even conservative Jewish positions on things, which I think then requires us to think about how we go about setting up alternative institutions. That's going to be one thing. Secondly, politics, I think, is still open. Because we live in a democracy, it's still possible. And there are two sides to that. One, if a member of my congregation came to me and said, I'm thinking of running for state senate, or I'm thinking of running for federal government on this ticket, what do you think? Well, I'd do a couple of things. One, I'd say, well, please don't use the church to stump for votes. We don't want to bring that, but I would say, go and do it. But I would say to him, be aware that, politics is a dirty business, and you're probably going to have to make compromises. Then I'd want to talk to my congregation and say, this guy, sometimes he's going to vote for a bill in Congress that's going to contain things that you think are not Christian. But let me explain to you, that's how politics works. And if this guy is only ever going to vote for bills that he can 100% agree with, he's going to be voting against every bill that ever comes on the floor. And we need to be in prayer for him that he always acts. We may not agree with what he does, but we need to, as Christians, be praying for this guy that he has wisdom to always do the best thing in any situation. The other side of transformation, I think, as you've touched on it, is if underlying a lot of what I've said this evening is that the battle has been lost because we lost the moral imagination of society. How do you regain the moral imagination? Well, I think that comes through writing, it comes through movies, it comes through sitcoms, and some of the things I've already said apply to that. It's going to be difficult to get it's going to be difficult to get a contract to produce a sitcom on a certain thing or a movie. One of the things I admire about the Catholic Church is they do take the moral imagination seriously. Graham Greene. I think The Power and the Glory might be, and Graham Greene was not a particularly conservative Catholic, but I think The Power and the Glory might be the most Christian novel ever written. I think Shisako Endo's The Silence is a wonderful novel. Now, those things aren't transforming society, but they're certainly capturing the imaginations of intelligent people who then go on to have an impact. So I would say, yeah, the problem with Protestantism in general and evangelicalism in particular is that we do Christian art and culture so badly. I like Bob Dylan. I don't think Bob Dylan should have won the Nobel Prize. I like Bob Dylan, but I think that some of his worst songs are his Christian songs. I think, I'm trying to think of, it's gone from my mind, but some of his non-Christian lyrics are actually more expressive of Christian struggle than his Christian songs are. So I think one of the problems we have as Protestants is we don't have intelligent writers and thinkers doing that sort of stuff for us. So yeah, I agree. But I think we have to think in terms of not just who do we vote for, but getting people into the right positions and for them working faithfully in those positions. And transformation doesn't come overnight. The liberal left has not achieved this overnight. It's achieved this of decades of carefully training up the right people in the legal profession, making sure that the right messages are sent in the movies and commercials and things. It's been done. I don't think it's been done as one vast conspiracy, but I think a lot of moving pieces have come together. But it's taken some decades for us to reach a position where now everything, like the dominoes, are suddenly all falling at once. And again, it goes back to my answer to the earlier question. I don't think it's going to happen for us in the next 30, 40, 50 years. I think it's a long way away. It might do. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, perhaps, but just boycotting Disney isn't going to achieve it. It's ironic, I think, now when Christians complain about the left imposing its views by boycotts, because that was something the Southern Baptists kind of perfected in the 1980s, and their strategy is now being used to great effect to beat them around the head with. With the measure you measure it out, it will ultimately be measured back to you.
Dr. Trueman, real quick question. And a preference, I will stand up for Bob Dylan's Christian material. It's excellent, actually. But that's the thing about taste. There's no accounting. So, but I do appreciate the bit you mentioned about in your talk of the role of the church, and to kind of segue off your comments in the question and answer here about death being an opportunity for us to use there's a lot of pastors in the room, I think, and if you go back to your point about the role of the word sacrament and prayer being a essential kind of vanguard for how we approach going forward, do you think there's not an opportunity as well in the preaching of the word to sound themes of creation itself and the incarnation in particular that you can use to educate not only our people but the culture around us as they hear us who sit under the preaching to make our case that we are not taking our identity from within, but we receive our identity from God.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're faithfully preaching the word, those kind of themes will come up. One must be aware of making them the dominant theme, I think, in your ministry. But if you're consistently preaching through books of the Bible, then surely those kind of things will come up. And again, to return to death, I think death is, it's strange to say, but I think death is a great opportunity for speaking to unbelievers about how, there is an external authority that defines our life, even if you'll only accept it in terms of the limits of our life, that there'll come a time when your life will end and you will have no control over that. Just as an aside, it's interesting, it seems to me that there are various things we do in culture relative to death. One, we pushed the physical reality of death out of the public eye. Churches typically don't have graveyards by them anymore. What an experience it would have been to go to worship when you walk past the grave of your father, to go to church on a Sunday. And secondly, the whole idea of euthanasia is an attempt to grasp control of death. And thirdly, turning funerals into celebrations of life. And I think one thing Christians should never do is turn a funeral into a celebration of life. That is an absolute capitulation to the mindset of the world, because death is an inappropriate intrusion into creation, and it does reduce those who are left behind. I don't want to celebrate my father's death when he died. I wanted him still to be alive. And even now, as I look back on the happy times, I always look back on the happy times I had with my dad through the lens of the grief of his passing. It's not the same looking back on the happy times now that it was 15 years ago looking back on the happy times, because I know how it ends. And I think one of the ways that Christians can get to the idea of external authority is honest preaching about death and honest death rites. Book of Common Prayer, the funeral rites in the Book of Common Prayer, wonderful. Mainly wonderful because they just quote the Bible on death, and the Bible nowhere celebrates death. Nobody's death is a celebration in the Bible.
Could you speak to, I guess there could be an argument made that Jesus' disciples, Paul, never tried to transform culture. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's a good argument. I mean, Paul is living in a very hostile world, and he's calling, if anything, when he writes to the Colossians, for example, he's calling on them to be heavenly minded. Now, he also calls on Christians to pray for the civil magistrate. I think there's plenty of evidence in the New Testament to indicate, Paul uses his Roman citizenship. Nowhere does Paul call on Christians to withdraw from society, so I think it's a reasonable assumption to make that he believes that Christians will operate in a way informed by their faith in the society of which they are a part, but he points them heavenward all the time. And I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. We shouldn't go the way of withdrawal. We shouldn't go the way of assuming that we have no vested interest in this world. It's God's creation, after all. But we should realize that ultimately there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth, and our destiny and our identity lie in heaven. But yeah, it seems to me that Paul does not spend a lot of time fretting over pagan Roman culture. He spends a lot of time fretting over the intrusion of that culture into the church. That's his real concern. 1 Corinthians would be a good example of that.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
something I've seen in addition to the examples you gave is within the corporate world. And just to give an example, measuring efficiencies of the business and the people. I've seen it go just in the last 20 years from, you know, what you can produce to right now we're moving into an emotional engagement being the be-all and end-all of a business's ability to be successful and how you will be judged. And that's one side of it. The other side of it is seeing the corporate culture as the new family rather than your actual family. And it's actually at least from my vision, supplanting the church's role and the family's role and playing right into this whole conspiracy, if you want to call it. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are
interesting. On that. Your comment about the corporate world, I have no experience myself. My one son works in it, my other son is going into it. I have no experience of it myself firsthand. But it's interesting to me how, you know, nowadays you can be a big corporate businessman and save the planet at the same time. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was you could be a big businessman or you could be concerned about the planet. Now you can be both. That big business has developed this ethical field which perhaps connects with the emotional field that you're pointing to as well. The second point, I think, yes. And I fear that the corporate world there is stepping into a vacuum that's been created by the lack of true friendship and true community in church and the breakdown of the family. It struck as I was preaching through Samuel. I came last week. I'm preaching the sermon here tomorrow, actually, on, you know, Jonathan's soul was knit to that of David. Well, you preach on that today, and at some point I have to say, oh, by the way, it's not a homosexual relationship. Nothing is further. There's nothing further from the writer's mind than that. Why do I have to say that today? Because friendship has become so attenuated that the idea of a deep and loving friendship between two men has to be sexualized, partly thanks to Freud, our friend Freud and Reich here, where everything ultimately comes down to sex. The 19th century, you can read letters that John Henry Newman wrote to Ambrose St. John, another priest, and they're passionate letters between two men who were friends. There was nothing gay about their friendship at all. They were two men who were friends. We have lost that. Society's taken that away from us. And I think part of the church's rebellion against society is we need to make the church a place where real deep friendship can exist. I mean, there's a whole thing in the church now where men shouldn't travel in a car on their own with a woman. On one hand, I understand the sense of that. On the other hand, I think what you've basically done by doing that is you've said that you've turned the woman into merely an object of desire here. And you've reduced that relationship to a sexual one. We need to recapture the healthy, deep notion of friendship. And I wonder if, I said earlier on, we shouldn't look at things necessarily as judgments, but I wonder if the ease with which the corporate world is able to fake friendship is the fact that friendship and family have become so attenuated and meaningless in the rest of the world. But human beings, it's not right for us to be alone. We crave friendship. And if we don't find it in the church and we don't find love in the family, we will find it somewhere else. Lesbian and gay community, the corporate world, wherever.
Okay, got two more.
Hi.
Hi.
A lot of people here at Redeemer have family members who are in the LGBTQ community. And you mentioned, that there's basically a redefinition of humanity. And if we're coming with complete basic definition of humanity as being different, how do we begin to engage
Very good question.
people like that?
I think, first of all, we need to make a distinction that I don't think I made at the start. We need to make a distinction in the church between pastorally addressing individuals who are subject to this and addressing the overall political and philosophical agenda that's driving the wider thing. And really tonight I was addressing that wider question. On the individual thing, I think it's very difficult. And I wouldn't go straight for do you realize you're buying into a whole metaphysics of personhood that's completely, I think you've got to address the particular person in their particular situation. And basic to us being able to do that, I want to say this has got to be in place before we can do that, is the church has to be a community. Because you can't take somebody out of one community and not give them anything to replace it with. Or you can't address somebody who's being lured by one community, the positives and the negatives of that one community drawing them, without having something equal and opposite, or hopefully better, to draw them with the other way. So I think the basic foundation for addressing individuals would be to be able to show them a better way that's already existing. And then I think the pastoral care for that person, so often in pastoral situations, every case is so different. Students in class will say, well, how would you deal with a guy who's committed adultery? And I says, well, I need to know the back. I need to know, was it a loving marriage that went wrong because he got drunk one night and did something stupid, or have they grown apart over it? Every situation's different, and I think it's the same with people subject to same-sex attraction or lesbian and gay identity. Every case is going to be different, and therefore you have to address that person in terms of their own history and where they are in particular. But I would want to, A, be able to show them there's something better. B, I'd want to listen. I'd want to listen to what they have to say first. And thirdly, I'd want to commit myself to the long haul. Because it's not, it's hard enough working with couples where there's been an abusive partner. That never ends quick. It takes months, if not years, to work through that. Maybe this is a lifetime commitment of support you've got to give. I think don't look for instant change, and be forgiving with lapses, short-term or long-term. These are human beings you're dealing with, and treat them in the way that you would hope they would treat you if the boot was on the other foot. So that's a rather vague answer in terms of the particulars, but I think the most fundamental thing is to make that distinction, to realize that the stuff I'm talking about tonight, that's the big stuff which plays into the politics of the public square. I think pastors need to remember that when they're dealing with an individual, they're dealing with an individual. They're not dealing with a metaphysics or a philosophy.
You wrote a blog post, I believe it was a little while back, on how the pro-life movement has made strides, not due to the logic of the argument, but due to the aesthetics. And for the same reason, that's why actually gay marriage will go in the other direction, away from the idea of the traditional views of the church. So my question is how do people within the church make an impact on people that have these differing ideas on issues, when there's a certain group of people that are going to reject logical reasoning and default to valuing the aesthetic as the determining
it's a tough one. The context of that post, I'd been on a panel with Robert George from Princeton, and I gave a very pessimistic speech about how I thought the future was going to go, and he said, no, we made huge inroads on the pro-life movement. And I thought I went away and thought about that and thought, well, yes, but a lot of that comes down to sonograms. When you're able to show people that what's in the womb looks like a person and moves like a person and has a heart that beats like a person's heart, that captures the imagination. It's not an argument, but it pulls on the heartstrings. I think the thing about gay marriage is, there's a sense in which on the day the Supreme Court judgment comes out, you see happy people coming out of registry offices. They got married, they're happy. Who doesn't, I don't want people to be unhappy. Nobody wants people to be unhappy. So even if you disagree with gay marriage, the aesthetics, even for somebody like me, the aesthetics go in the other direction. My wife's hairdresser is a gay guy, lives with a gay person. We like him. He's a great guy. I don't want to make him unhappy. So the aesthetics, it's tough. So first of all, I think the life issue and the sexuality issue, they're not good. The sexuality, it's hard to see what the aesthetic would be. And again, it brings me back to, well, I think the church. And here we hit a real problem, because I think one of the great underrated bands of the 1970s are the Boomtown Rats. Rat Trap was one of their big hits, and there's a line in that about the rat traps all over the place, and they were all sprung before we were born. I think the church today lives with the appalling record of the church of yesterday on marriage. We've not taken marriage seriously. We've allowed people to divorce with impunity. Now, that's not to say I believe there are biblical grounds for divorce. They are adultery, in which case the innocent party is free to marry again, and they are abandonment, in which case it seems to me that if you read Paul, take Paul at what he's saying is, you have to assume that the one who's abandoned is an unbeliever and excommunicate them. The church has never taken divorce seriously. The church redefined marriage when it didn't do that. The church made marriage into a sentimental bond that can be broken with impunity as and when it becomes inconvenient for one or both of the partners. Well, that's the principle of marriage upon which gay marriage has been built, I think. Certainly I agree with Robert George's arguments on that point. So I think the church is now in a terrible bind, and when people say, well, you won't inscribe a cake for a gay couple, but you'll inscribe a cake for a divorced couple, I think that's a good argument. I think they're making a good point there. And that brings me to the point that I'm not sure how we can mount a fight back, because our aesthetics aren't just not there. They're really, really bad, actually. We just look like a bunch of homophobic hypocrites because we've singled out gay people. You're not allowed to have marriage as a temporary bond between two people for emotional and sexual satisfaction for as long as you want it to be. You're not allowed to do that. But any heterosexual couple that decide to break with the biblical teaching on marriage, they can do it. That's homophobic, or at least it sounds homophobic. So I think the first thing the church needs to do is it needs to take marriage seriously again. And unfortunately, aesthetically, that's going to look bad in the short term, because it means we're going to start excommunicating people who abandon their partners or who commit adultery and don't repent of it. And that's going to be hard. We're doing it at my church at the moment. We've got 2 cases at my church. We're not quite sure what to do. And bottom line is, we've got to bring the hammer down. Because if we take marriage seriously, then we need to bring the hammer down. And it's really unpleasant to do that. And it potentially splits the church every time you do it, because everybody takes sides. But I think that's where it begins. So we begin with a negative aesthetic. We begin with, hey, taking the Bible's teaching on marriage seriously and applying it across the board, not just to gay couples, but to heterosexual couples as well. That's a really bleak note to end on.
Well,
sorry.
I'm going to try to cheer it up a little. I would request... Sure.
Yep. Yep. Well, I don't believe God intervened, because I believe God is always sovereign. I don't think he intervenes. I think everything is governed according to his will. So even if Donald Trump had lost, I think that would be God's will. So I don't think it was an intervention. I think it was part of God's sovereignty. Secondly, of course, I think Judeo-Christian, I think Christian people will exist. Why? Because your name is Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. We know how it ends. The church wins. We know how it ends. I don't care who wins what election. I know how it ends. Now, does it end by my nation surviving? Does it end by my denomination surviving? No. There's no promises to the OPC as the OPC. There's no promises to America as America. There are promises to the church that the gates of hell will not prevail. So yeah, I'm very optimistic long term. Personally, as I say, unless Christ returns in the next 30 years, I think it's going to get tougher and tougher for you and for me. But God is in control. That's why I say I don't like the language of intervention. I do like the language of God being sovereign in control. Was Donald Trump's appointment part of God's providence? Absolutely. What he's intending to do by that, I don't know. Absolutely part of his providence, and that providence will ultimately culminate in the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. The church will be there at the marriage feast of the Lamb and will be presented to Christ as a perfect bride. That's an optimistic note to end on.
It is. No, I have a different note. Of all the things you said, the thing that struck me personally was those few words you said about death. I thought that was very helpful. It was to me personally. It's ironic that you used that example because we have a cemetery. It's not the church's cemetery. It just happened to have been here since the 1800s. At any rate, my father's buried there right behind us.
Wow.
So I drive by every day. I drive by his tombstone, and I don't, for the longest time, I thought that was a mistake until like 10 minutes ago. I guess I just always felt like we should have put it in the back because I have to see it every day. But now with this new way of, because of what you say, I preach, I believe it. It reduces us. I don't think it's something we celebrate when death happens, and all of that is things I say. But personally, when I thought of that gives me a new motivation about preaching, because that death is a gross aberration, and it reminds me of my own father's earthly remains there. In his story, he became a Christian in the last 5 years of his life after a whole life in the Roman Catholic Church. So thank you for that. And I would request in front of all these people that you would do some kind of post on that topic at First Things. I think that was a very helpful, the idea of driving by, we don't drive by the cemeteries anymore, and that kind of impact and death and how, I know you can't write too much, maybe do three-parter. But anyways, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and the early Christian, in the ancient world, the earliest Christians, they used to meet for meals in areas where there were tombs, where their dead Christians had gone before, partly to remind themselves of the reality of death, but partly also because the dead continued to be present in the land of the living. And you see that there's a famous painting of Luther preaching. Lucas Cranach paints this picture of Luther preaching, and he's standing in a pulpit, and he's got a hand on the Bible, and his fingers pointing out to a crucifix. So he's doing what he's meant to be doing. He's preaching from the Bible and pointing to Christ. And then in the congregation on the other side, there are a few people, and then there's his family. And two of the children have scarves that come up over their mouths. And that's an indication that they were dead. But when the painter painted them, he painted the family as a whole. So even the dead were still part of the family. And again, it's something we've lost. When the dead are gone, they're gone. We've forgotten that. But the dead were very, very present.
Now, here's the last thing I wanted to read and then have you maybe make a comment on it because I thought it was so helpful. You just did a sermon for a man who was ordained, and you wrote this in your post about that. You said, I had the privilege of preaching at the ordination of a friend to the ministry of the Word and Sacrament in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I preached on a text from 2 Timothy. My friend took vows to care for the people in his church, and life then carried on as normal. My friend will preach Christ week by week. He will baptize infants, administer the Lord's Supper, perform weddings, visit the sick, prepare the living for death, comfort the mourning, and bury the dead. This is because Christian ministry continues the same as ever in its basic elements, regardless of what the wider political context is. And if we want to talk about all the ways we can make an impact, we undervalue what God has given us as the way we make an impact, I think, when we just act like this is nothing.
Yeah.
And so maybe...
Yeah, what I was trying to get at there as well is that for most people, the experience of life goes on much the same, year by year. Politicians come, politicians go. But by and large, the basic elements of life, people are born, they go to school, they fall in love, they fall out of love, they get married, they become parents, they become grandparents, they grow old, they get ill, they die. These are parts of all of our experiences, and that doesn't change and hasn't changed. The way it's done perhaps has changed a bit over time, and we live longer now, but human existence is still, in many ways, very much the same today as it has been for many centuries, and the task of the minister remains the same. And the answer, what is the ultimate human problem that everybody faces, is death. And the answer remains the resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. So the ministry, I think, the ministry is meant to be boring and routine. It grinds on year by year doing the same thing. Maybe the idiom changes a little bit, but the basic elements remain the same because the basic elements of human life and the human condition remain the same.
Thanks for those great words. Why don't you join me in thanking Dr. Trueman for coming and sharing with us.